So let's talk a little bit about Epic of Gilgamesh. Um, there's a character in it called Enkidu. Enkidu, I don't know how you say it.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering how that character, or just the epic in general, influenced Genesis.
Yeah, that's a sort of a broad and complicated question that I'd say we can sort of wrap our arms around, but not all the way. And of course, there's no like uniform agreement on how exactly that took place or the extent to which it took place. So when you think about the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, you have what's called the primeval history.
Yeah.
And there's a progression that is given its time and place of writing, generally speaking, it's pretty clear, I think, to most people in the field. There is a polemic of sorts going on when it comes to Babylonian mythology and the way that so if you think about Mesopotamia and you think about how particularly in that epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, what its focus is, it's very clear that the way this story opens and the way this story closes is very intentional. It forms an inclusio, and it starts with Gilgamesh at the city of Uruk talking about open the tablet box, look at the walls, look at how big the city is, and at the end you have Gilgamesh having gone through all of the things that he underwent, coming back to that same speech. Look at the walls of Uruk, look at the city. In other words, the city civilization is the focus, right? It is the thing that everything is moving toward. So it's the pinnacle, right? It's what humanity should be striving toward, is this city. Mm-hmm. And when we think about the character of Enkidu, he makes a progression that is in the same vein, right? It's in the same direction. So he is set up as Gilgamesh's sort of, counterpart by the gods to sort of bring him into check, to, focus him maybe. But the way that he's created is he's thrown out into the steppe. He's created in the steppe, and so he's like he has very animalistic qualities to him, and so he drinks at the watering hole. He runs with the animals, and he sets a lot of the animals free from the traps of the hunter, and ultimately, Shamhat, the prostitute, goes out to him, has sex with him for a week, and he loses this essential quality of his that makes him more in line with the animal kingdom, and brings him more in line with being a human, with being a man. And the things that go along with that are he's clothed and he eats bread and drinks beer, and then ultimately is brought to the city. And then, of course, in the story, he dies, right? Which is sort of the ultimate thing about, from a mortality. I mean, from a human standpoint, thinking about mortality. But when we think about that movement in the Epic of Gilgamesh, everything is towards civilization, away from innocence, away from, the more animalistic qualities. That's a good thing. The movement is toward the city, toward civilization, and it's good.
Yeah.
In Genesis 1 through 11, you have that same progression, but it's bad.
Yeah.
So when you think about Adam and Eve are created, they're created innocent. Adam has all the animals brought before him. to try to find a helper that's, suitable for him. And no animal was found. And so then Eve is created, but they're naked, they're innocent, they don't know anything. But then they undergo this bad transformation, which is toward knowledge. It's towards gaining understanding and gaining wisdom, learning the secrets of the world and of the gods. And ultimately, that progression takes the story to the city and the Tower of Babel. And of course, Babel is Babylon, and so it's not subtle in any way. The movement is people are going toward the city and toward Mesopotamia, toward Babylonia, which is what the story is sort of railing against. And so, following, yeah, go ahead.
Is this related to sort of the Babylonian captivity at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all sort of bound up in that, at least to some degree, right? Because the animosity that's felt against the Babylonians for that, I mean, I think is absolutely clear. But that's certainly during the Neo-Assyrian period, the period that was just before that in the first millennium, Babylonia was still an incredibly important religious, religious area, right? I mean, it's where the Neo-Assyrian kings every year during the Akitu festival the New Year's festival would go down and swear allegiance essentially to Marduk and to Babylonia, because Babylonia was sacred. It's where many of the gods were, the very important gods were. And so I think that ultimately, whether we want to see this as a polemic during the period of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, or want to see it during the Neo-Assyrian period, it's still, or even post, even following the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the captivity, it's still focused in, and I think reasonably so, on the animosity that they felt toward, that region. And I think then the climax of this with the the city and the Tower of Babel, the people are dispersed, and it's at that moment that Abram is called, and he's not called from anywhere. He, like anywhere random. He's called out of Mesopotamia, right? He's called out of Ur of the Chaldees, and he doesn't go to another city. He wanders, right? And so I think that, again, this is very important to recognize that movement toward the city. It's a good thing in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a bad thing in Genesis.
Nice. Right. Let's move on to a different topic here. How similar is the Code of Hammurabi to the Ten Commandments and the other laws laid down in the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, that's another sort of debated topic. They're clearly very similar. Like, I don't think anybody debates that, whether and certain certain parts, for example, the covenant code in Exodus 21, and it's chapter 20 into 23, or the end of 22. That area called the covenant code is very similar, right? And people like, I think it's Christopher Wright, wrote a book where he argues sort of on one end of the spectrum that the writer of of Exodus is pulling directly from the Code of Hammurabi, and others would just say, no, this is sort of in the air, right? It's obviously influenced. It obviously originates in Mesopotamia, what we see in the Hebrew Bible, but that sort of legal rationale, though it is clearly indebted to things like the Code of Hammurabi, maybe isn't borrowing directly from it in the sense that, like, they're thinking about the Code of Hammurabi as they draft the covenant code. But I mean, there are obvious parallels between them. there's a book out, a 2-volume set that was published in 2001 by edited together by Raymond Westbrook, called like, and I really should just memorize what the title is, but it's like Law in the Ancient Near East,
Yeah.
or Ancient Near Eastern Law. And that book is, I mean, you can see essentially what he's done is he's called experts from all of the various fields in the different time periods of the ancient Near East: Egypt, Syria, Palestine, the Hittites, the Assyrians, Babylonians, and had them present, sort of legal summaries of the way that law worked in these different regions, these different periods. And the reason that, including Israel, ancient Israel, and the reason that you can do that is because they're so similar.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, there's no question that the laws in the Hebrew Bible obviously come later, and they're directly like they're reliant, heavily indebted to things like the Code of Hammurabi. And some scholars would argue that they're directly indebted, that there's direct borrowing that's going on.
Yeah. Right. So I picked up this NIV Compact Dictionary to the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
There's this quote in here I want to get your opinion on.
Okay.
So I'll just read it and then you can give your thoughts. It says, the two accounts of creation do not conflict, just as a map of the United States does not conflict with a map of the whole world. Genesis 1 describes the creation of the universe as a whole. Genesis 2, 4-25 covers one special segment of that creation.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the standard evangelical, at least a type of evangelical approach to the problem that is very, very clear between Genesis 1 and Genesis 1, 1-2, 4, 2, 3, whatever, and 2, 4-25. And that is that it's very clearly, from a literary standpoint, two very different accounts of of creation. And it's not just a matter of the order of events, although that is clearly problematic, right? It's the entire nature and character of the creation events, right? The creation story. So in the first, it's much more magisterial, right? God is creating in such a way that he is very much transcendent over creation. He's above it. He's in complete control of it. There aren't mistakes that are made, right? This is he speaks and it happens. Everything is very well organized, and it's designed in just that way. When you think about Genesis 2, the deity is different, right? He's much more anthropomorphized. He's walking in the garden. He's having conversations with the people. He asks questions like, "Hey, where are you?" And he makes mistakes, right? He brings all the animals before Adam to see if one's gonna, and there isn't, and none of them work, right? So he tries a different way. And he sort of makes decisions seemingly on the spur of the moment, right? And of course, you could take these theological approaches to all of these problems and say, well, God's condescending to mankind, and of course, that's what you do with theology. But the reality is that it was very clear when scholars read this, that wait a minute, there's a problem, and these things seem very, very different. So, like, one of the things that's incredibly problematic, and I have a chapter in actually this book, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. There's a chapter that talks about this. Did Moses write the Pentateuch? And this is one of the things that scholars like Joel Baden, for example, focus in on. And they see the contradictions, the narrative contradictions between those two stories. So, for example, when were the animals created? If you look in Genesis 1, it's very clear that the animals are all created, and then at the end, the humans are created, and they're created together. Mm-hmm. In Genesis 2, man is created separately, and then all the animals are created and brought to him. And only after that, for a very specific reason, is the woman created, right? So they're created separately, and the animals are created after the man. So what scholars have done, evangelical scholars have done, or Christian apologists, is, excuse me, they've come to the Hebrew and they said, well, maybe when it says, and God created the animals, what that is it's the Hebrew using a pluperfect form. And what that means, for those listening that maybe don't know, it's God had created the animals, to try to make that sort of fit with, this thing having been done in Genesis 1. Of course, not only is there no reason, there is no pluperfect form in biblical Hebrew, no strictly pluperfect form. So you have to just, if you're going to do that, the very few times that scholars would argue, grammarians would argue that there is a pluperfect, sense to a form, it's all driven by context. And the only reason that one would submit that there is contextual rationale is if one is trying to argue that, it's a continuous narrative. But of course, even on the one hand, there's no positive evidence for there being a pluperfect usage there. There's also negative evidence for there being a pluperfect, because the Hebrew form there is sort of the standard narrative sequential form. And then this happened, and then this happened, and then the animals were created, and then Eve was created. So it's very much intending from a literary standpoint to say this is a sequence of events. So this is why this idea that there's, apologists have argued, or evangelical scholars have argued, well, it's like, you get like the big picture, and then you get like the more step by step, and it's not really, they'll argue that it's not like chronologically organized, all kinds of different sort of tricks. But the reality is that you don't have to do that, right? If you can just step back and say, this isn't Moses writing this thing, that we're actually looking at, multiple sources, it makes everything make sense.
It's kind of funny because you actually don't find very many Jews who are biblical literalists. It's more, it's still the evangelical.
Yeah. So it's telling.
Okay. Okay, let's talk about violence. It's a good segue. So which kind of chapters and verses in the Hebrew Bible deal with wiping out of other tribes or nations, and are they kind of fictional, and how much history is it to it, and how would you have reconciled them when you were a Christian?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are lots of different places that we could turn to that sort of talk about this thing, this aspect of violence and divinely commanded violence. I have a chapter in volume 2 of this series that's being edited right now. And actually, I just submitted a contribution to an edited volume that's coming out hopefully later this year, on evangelical misuse of the Old Testament, and it's on this very topic. So yeah, I mean, the two places that most people sort of go to, but the two places that we usually see are the conquest of Joshua, the conquest of Canaan under Joshua and the Israelites, and passages like 1 Samuel 15 with Saul, being commanded by God to go and to wipe out the Amalekites. And the reason that those two narratives are sort of focused in on is because they're clearly divine commands by God, and the narrative focuses on them being total and complete in nature, right? So if you think about the conquest under Joshua, sort of the background to it for those listening that may not know, Israel had been brought up out of Egypt under Moses in the Exodus account. And because of their sin, they were forced to wander around the wilderness south of Israel for 40 years, roughly 40 years, until that generation died out. And then Moses as well dies. And under Joshua as the leader, they come into the land, they conquer several major cities over on the east side of the Jordan River first, so like Sihon and Og, and then they cross over under Joshua and they take out cities like Jericho and Ai, and then they fight in both the north and the south, and take out a bunch of major cities there. And the reason that sort of thing is important in this discussion is, how is it that Yahweh, who is, under Christian theology, the God of the Old Testament, is, part of the triune Godhead, how is it that he can command genocide, right, and the death or the extermination of entire people groups, right, including women and children, and have that called out specifically, that they're to be wiped out? And so what apologists have done, the name that always comes to mind for me is Paul Copan, who wrote the book, one amongst many, Is God a Moral Monster? And he sort of makes the argument that most evangelical scholars do. It's sort of a two-pronged approach. One is that the people that were annihilated, that were commanded to be killed by Yahweh, were very, very wicked and absolutely deserving of that punishment. And in fact, Yahweh would have been unjust had he not commanded their extermination. In addition to that argument, which is incredibly problematic, they will also say, well, it's also hyperbole, right? So when it says kill men, women, children, kill everybody, don't let anyone remain alive, and it didn't really mean that, and so it's just hyperbolic language. And they will often take it a step further to make it say, like they'll give the analogy, well, when your kid's football team goes and plays another football team, in the locker room, they'll say like, all right, we're going to go slaughter them, and, are you really slaughtering them? No, it's just hyperbolic language. Okay. Obviously, those are incredibly problematic. The first hinges, without going into much detail, hinges entirely upon you. You have to believe what it's saying. And what I talk about in the book and in this edited volume is, would we do this anywhere else? And I give some other Neo-Assyrian examples, some examples from the wider ancient Near East, where other kings make similar claims, right? They'll say that our God commanded us to go and to conquer these other nations because they were rebellious or because they were wicked. And, would we just take those royal inscriptions at face value? Would we say, oh my gosh, well, the Neo-Assyrian king must have been perfectly justified. Those people must have been terribly, terribly wicked. And we would say, no, of course not. It's propaganda, right? He's trying to justify his actions. And so, I think this is the problem with this particular apologetic. The other thing that like this other argument about rhetoric or hyperbole is, yes, on the one hand, that there's absolutely no doubt, nobody argues that there's hyperbole in some of these ancient Near Eastern types of inscriptions, this genre of text. Again, the Neo-Assyrians did this all the time. They would say, we went down and we absolutely exterminated all the people of X city. But of course, they didn't do that, right? They killed a lot of them. But this was just sort of, the way that they talked. The problem is, one, they still killed a lot of them, right? So are we okay with it then? But the other problem is, from a narratival, from a literary standpoint, many of these narratives hinge on, absolutely require the total nature, the total, the language to be total in nature. And one example that we can give is this, passage in First Samuel 15 with the Amalekites, because Saul is told by Samuel, he's commanded to go in and to wipe out the Amalekites, but because of what the Amalekites had done, centuries earlier to the Israelites. And it says, kill everybody, man, women, children, ox, cattle, everything, right? Kill them all. And Saul goes and kills almost everybody, right? But he saves the king and he saves some of the best animals, right? So almost everybody, king and the best animals. And the mission in the text is considered a total failure.
Yeah.
In fact, Saul in the story is rejected as king because he failed, right? So the idea that there is a room for hyperbole here just isn't borne out, because Saul had the hyperbole been like God's command, go kill everybody. If Saul had understood that to be ancient Near Eastern rhetoric, like, well, go kill a bunch of them, but obviously don't kill all of them, the story would make no sense. Saul would have been able to say, whoa, why are you upset with me, God? But you didn't mean kill everybody, right? And so, the story itself, the narrative itself, rises and falls on the totality of that command. Sorry, the last thing that you asked me was how I would have reconciled these things. And for me, it's probably going to be an uninteresting answer because the way that I would have handled this and the way that I did handle this was, look, God has morally justified reasons, right? When God gives a command, who are we, right? Who are we to question God and his commands? And God knows more than we do. We'll know when we get to heaven, right, why it is that God commanded these things. So we just have to trust. So not a terribly articulate or well thought out defense or apologetic. That's how I would have done it.
All right. Which ancient Near Eastern flood myth influenced the Genesis story the most?
I would say probably what we see in the stories of Atrahasis and in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the reason that I say that is because, both are utilizing, Atrahasis comes first. It's, written. So Atrahasis influenced, clearly was picked up and utilized by the Sinlaki Unini, the compiler, the writer, the author, whatever, of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so, we know this because not only is the story the same, right, and the major components of the story are the same, but we have actual sort of Akkadian words that appear in the Hebrew Bible, and so it's like there's clear utilization of that myth, those that mythology, the story itself. But the other thing that is telling, I think, is the way that, remember how I said earlier that Genesis 1 through 11 is acting as a polemic against Mesopotamian culture and mythology. Well, in this particular case with the flood narrative, the major thing I think that the story is doing is it's contrasting Yahweh with Enlil. And Enlil is the main deity in the flood stories of Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh, who brings the flood. And when he brings the flood, the story refers to him acting evil, like in an evil way, like the thing that he does is evil. And so Yahweh is contrasted here with Enlil by saying, no, not only is he not evil, but also conversely, that mankind is wicked, mankind is evil, and deserving completely of this worldwide flood. And so I think it's a very clear polemic of the Babylonian myths.
Okay, my last big question here is, I'm not sure if you have an answer for this, but how did ancient Jewish people read the Genesis creation stories?
Yeah, that's a tough question. It's difficult when we try to get back to like what people thought, how people like that their personal beliefs. It's difficult to sort of ascertain that sort of thing. Actually, a really good essay on this, if people are interested just in that topic, is A. Leo Oppenheim in a book called Mesopotamia: Portrait of a Dead Civilization. He talks about, he's got this section, why a Mesopotamian religion should not be written. And one of the things like that he talks about there is how do we get at what people actually believed, right? I mean, you can obviously think about their mythology and the stories that they write, but these are elite people who are, putting these things down. And so, of course, there's oral tradition that it's based on, but how much of it is being reworked? These are all very complicated questions. I would say, generally speaking, though, Genesis was probably understood to be what happened, right? And they wouldn't have thought about it in the sense that we think about history today. But if you would have asked, like, how did the world come into being, right? Or what does your world look like? Can you explain how the world functions? Well, they would say, yeah. I mean, like the world is, like this sort of flat thing that sits on these foundations where the netherworld is down there, and there's a big dome that goes over top of us, right? And that's sort of and the gods are up above that, right? And there are different heavens that are up there, and the reason that we see a blue sky is because that floor is actually made of a particular blue stone. Like, I mean, that was pretty common ancient Near Eastern cosmology. And so, I don't think there's any doubt that that's what they would have thought about that mythology that was there in Genesis. I think it's constructed in that way because it is what they believed.
Yeah. Thank you for doing this with me. I really enjoyed it, and it's very informative.
Well, I appreciate you having me. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Take care.
All right, you too.
Bye-bye.